Good morning, everyone, to ILSAF Insights in 2024. My name is Tilman Röder. I'm the co-host here with Idris Nasseri from the University of Paderborn. We belong to the organization ILSAF. This is the Institute for Law and Society in Afghanistan. And ILSAF Insights is a series of talks where we invite one outstanding scholar to discuss topics related to Afghanistan of special interest and particular significance. We will, in this talk, cover a few topics that I will mention to you in a moment. I would like to mention at this point already that we are recording this for an online upload, so other people can also watch this video later. And we welcome those people watching it at a later stage as well. All those who are here present in the room, our audience, you're cordially invited to share your questions or your comments in the chat. We will pick up as many of them as we can during the talk and also later. Today's topic is who represents Afghanistan, and that is a difficult question. As we all know, the current Taliban government, the Taliban regime is not accepted by all other governments in the world. However, they rule the country. And this situation leads to a number of very practical and relevant problems for states, but also for Afghan citizens, those living in the country, but also particularly those living in other countries. We will discuss these matters as thoroughly and according to what we have found out in our research. And we are happy to also learn from the audience through your questions and your comments. I would like to first briefly introduce my co-director and the chairperson of ILSAF, that is Idris Nasseri. He is a professor of Islamic law at the Institute for Islamic Theology at the University of Paderborn. He does a fantastic job to chair and represent ILSAF in many different fora. And we together developed this idea and the concept for this talk. Unfortunately, our third co-director, Seyfullah Akbari, Dr. Akbari, cannot join us today. She has some family reasons to be absent, and we send her our greetings and warm wishes, and we hope that in the next talk she will be with us. Seyfullah Akbari is in our circle of directors, our small group responsible for the annual conference, and 3 times she already did a fantastic job organizing that, and I would like to mention this to everybody because every one of you is also always welcome to join the annual Afghan Legal Studies Conference that always takes place in late summer. But now we come to today's topic. As I mentioned, the key question is here, who represents Afghanistan? But there are other relevant questions that are of current significance. My first question to you, Idris, is what are the other important matters that you have in mind when thinking of Afghanistan and current questions?
I mean, there are a lot of questions which are coming to my mind, but I think the most important aspects are the representation legally, internationally. Then there will be always this issue of legitimizing the government, the de facto government in Afghanistan. But at the same time, all the challenges we just experiencing right now with the circumstances, how to dealing with the Afghans who applied for asylum in different countries of Europe and North America, dealing with their issues in regard of embassy and other papers that they need for their asylum. So there are a lot of aspects I think we can just shed some more light on it today.
Yes, we will do that. Thank you, Idris, for your short and very, very insightful answer on that. I'm now coming to you, Seyfullah, and we cordially welcome you. Assistant Professor Dr. Seyfullah Hasar teaches international law at Dicle University in Diyarbakir in Turkey. He has recently published two very insightful articles. One of them is actually a blog post that we read, and that's how we found you. The one is called Representation of Afghanistan Before the International Court of Justice. That appeared in the AGIL talk in October. And the other one from March 2024 is a scholarly article on recognition of governments in the case of the Taliban. Seyfullah, could you tell us briefly how you came to work on these critical topics?
And thank you, Tilman, for this kind introduction. I am, first of all, honored to be invited and very happy to be invited today. How did I come up with these research questions is actually starts with my PhD. My PhD was about the legality of foreign military intervention in civil wars at the request of the government. Like, can a government embattled with a civil war request military assistance from other states so that it can suppress the opposition groups? So one question that arose from this question was that how do we ascertain who is the government during, for example, a civil war or after a coup d'etat? So this was only one aspect of my PhD, and after finishing PhD, obviously, as an academic, you have to keep doing research. So I wanted to keep on this question, the question of how to ascertain the government of a state, the question of recognition of governments. And at that time, the Taliban took over Kabul. And so this was an interesting case because, as you said in the beginning, no state so far has formally recognized the Taliban. In addition to that, many of them explicitly, publicly, refuse to recognize Taliban until it meets certain conditions. And for reasons of international law, because this was, to me, a different state practice in terms of international law. So I wanted to examine the implications of this practice for international law. And then the question of representation before the ICJ arose. And then I applied my research to that question. Can the Taliban represent Afghanistan before the ICJ?
Thank you very much, Seyfullah. And actually, that fits very much to the, let's say, research agenda of ILSAF, the Institute for Law and Society in Afghanistan. We want to work on practical questions, but through the lens of research and through academic and scholarly work. That's why I think it fits very well talking to you today. Dear everyone, I'm now briefly telling you the sequence of our talk. We will start, first of all, with the ICC investigations into Afghanistan war crimes. ICC, as most of you will know, is the International Criminal Court in The Hague, and see what is the status of that and what the situation of having a de facto regime in the country affects this investigation and the further possible proceedings. From there, we'll go to the second question or complex, which is the upcoming case under the CEDAW, that is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, before the International Court of Justice, the ICJ. At this point, we will also briefly talk about the recent ECJ, the European Court of Justice decision on the right of asylum of Afghan women, which plays a role because both cases concern the situation of women in Afghanistan. That will be also a complex where we will talk a lot about this problem of a de facto regime. The third step in our talk will be discussing the question generally of diplomatic interactions with the Afghan state. How can this work? How can this function? How can other states interact with Afghanistan if they do not recognize the de facto government? And from there, we come to something that is of utmost importance for Afghans in other countries than Afghanistan. This is administrative acts performed by Afghan diplomats. Can they still act in behalf of the state? Can they, for example, issue visa, extend passports, extend or issue the birth certificates, and so forth? That is a very important practical question, and not an easy one in the lives of Afghans around the world. The last point that we want to briefly discuss is the question of Afghanistan's frozen state assets. Here we just want to look if we can present you an update on what is the situation with those. Maybe you remember that $7 billion that were frozen in the US, and there was some discussion of using this in different forms and different ways. We will also briefly talk about that. But now let's come to the first point. That's the ICC, the International Criminal Court's investigation in Afghanistan. And here I would first like to turn to you, Idris. What is the state of the investigations? What is happening at the moment?
Yeah, so the ICC, I hope everyone keeps that in mind. So it's about the ICC now, because it's mostly sometimes getting confusing with the ECE. So the ICC has resumed its investigation after a temporary suspension. So the primary focus lies on crimes committed by the Taliban and the ISIS so-called Khorasan province, giving the ongoing threat these groups pose. But however, actions by other actors like the US military are still under review. So the chief prosecutor Karim Khan has emphasized the urgency of addressing atrocities by the Taliban and the ISIS Khorasan province to ensure the accountability for crimes that directly impact civilian populations today. So that's the status quo right now.
What concrete crimes are under investigation? Are there examples of what happened and what is now under investigation by Karim Khan and his team?
Yeah, so the investigation covers a range of heinous acts. The Taliban's targeted assassination include the high-profile victims like the journalist and activist Malala Maiwand, killed in Jalalabad 2020. The ISIS Khorasan province is being investigated for mass casualty attacks, such as the 2021 bombing at the Kabul airport, which tragically claimed the lives of 170 civilians. So the US forces face certainty for the incidents like the torture of detainees at the CIA black sites and the 2019 bombing of the hospital in Kunduz, which resulted in civilian deaths. So there is a quite wide range of these acts, which I just summed up.
Yes, and Kunduz, we're in Germany, reminds us of the airstrikes in Kunduz, where very many, around 200 people were killed. And also that was a case which was scrutinized under German law by German courts without any conviction, but also an important case and a terrible incident that happened in the same region, in the same place. So if anyone would like to learn more about this Kunduz incident, in the Journal of Afghan Legal Studies, there is an article that looks into this court case in detail. But let's go back to the ICC. Idris, you've mentioned that there's a prioritization by the ICC on cases where the Taliban or Daesh in the Khorasan province, other possible perpetrators. What does that mean, prioritizing? What does it mean for the other cases, those possibly committed by international military forces?
Yes, so I mean, this prioritization effectively deprioritizes cases involving international military forces, such as the US. So while technically still on the docket, these cases are unlikely to progress to prosecution for the foreseeable future, I think. So this decision has been met with criticism, of course, from human rights organizations who argue, understandable argue, that it undermines the principle of equal accountability under international law. And it also raises questions about political pressures that may influence the ICC's strategy. So there are different aspects to consider.
Yeah, and so for this question, first one thing needs to be clarified. It is the individuals who are investigated by the ICC, not the state of Afghanistan. ICC investigates crimes committed by individuals. So then the question is why the ICC has to ascertain who is the government of the state of Afghanistan if it is not Afghanistan who is being prosecuted. So the reason ICC needed to ascertain who is the government is that because of the principle of complementarity in international criminal law. So ICC exercises its jurisdiction only if the state in question fails to investigate the same crimes under investigation by the chief prosecutor of the ICC. So for that, the ICC needs to seek observations from the state of Afghanistan to see if Afghanistan itself is investigating the same crimes. Because if Afghanistan itself is investigating the same crimes, ICC will not exercise its own jurisdiction. So the ICC sought observation from the former government already. But after Taliban took over control of Afghanistan, the prosecutor of the ICC argued that there is a change of circumstances on the ground, and arguing that from now on there is no prospect that the state of Afghanistan will investigate these crimes. So allow me to investigate these crimes. And so ICC felt that it needs to seek observations at this stage, so authorize the resumption of the investigation from the state of Afghanistan. It needs uh, to give a right to be heard to Afghanistan. So if Afghanistan will be able to investigate the crimes, it won't investigate. So the question is how to communicate with Afghanistan, how to seek observations from it. So basically, ICC applied the traditional test in international law. It is very controversial in international law how to ascertain the government of a state. But so the short answer is, and the traditional answer is, the generally accepted answer is, whichever entity is in effective control of a state and of the territory and the population, that entity qualifies as the government of that state. ICC applied this test, but without spelling that I am applying the effective control test. It reached, we understand from the process it applied, so it reached this conclusion in 3 steps. First, it said the changes of government doesn't affect the continuity of states. So it implied that Taliban is the government, as if the government has already changed. Changes of government doesn't affect state continuity. And it also relied practice of its own practice, like in ICC, the previous investigations of the ICC into the station in Mali and Darfur, Sudan. It said there were unconstitutional changes of governments in those states too, through like coup d'etats, and we kept communicating with whoever is in control. It also cited ICJ case law, like the case concerning Niger and Myanmar, saying in those cases too, ICJ communicated with whoever is in control of the state. So first step was this. The case law shows that changes of government doesn't affect the continuity of state. Secondly, ICC argued that also for the purposes of the proceedings, before the ICC, what matters is which government is in control, because we have to ascertain if Afghanistan can do the investigations itself. And for that purpose, we need to ascertain who is in control, who can do the investigations. For that purpose, too, de facto regime must be communicated, must be regarded as the contact point for Afghanistan. The third step, because there was a potential argument that, as you also raised in the beginning of the conversation, no state formally recognized Taliban as the government of Afghanistan. So doesn't it mean something in international law, like not a single state has formally recognized the Taliban? But the court minimized the value of this non-recognition. The court said, though no state has formally recognized the Taliban, many states, the United Nations, and some international organizations engaged with the Taliban or collaborated with the Taliban, held talks with the Taliban, and seemingly on behalf of Afghanistan. And so it said the non-recognition didn't mean much legally, because though not recognizing Taliban publicly, states treated Taliban as if it is the government of Afghanistan. And based on these three steps, we understand that it applied the test of effective control and it regarded the Taliban as the government of Afghanistan. So at the end, it said the present order that seeking observations from the state of Afghanistan should be communicated to the competent authorities of Afghanistan. It didn't spell the name of Taliban too, but it said de facto regime, etc. We understand that the order should be communicated to the Taliban. This proved very difficult because, yeah, the court ordered the registry of the court, because it is the registry who does these bureaucratic things. But the registry sent the order, transmitted the order to the actually Afghan embassy in The Hague, because the court also is in The Hague, and based on the law concerning International Criminal Court, the court always communicates with states through the embassies in The Hague. And this was the applicable law. So the registry said, in response, I transmitted the order in line with the applicable law to the Afghan embassy in The Hague, which has been under the control of the diplomats appointed by the former government, not the Taliban. But the registry said I had to do this because the applicable law requires me to send the order to the embassy in The Hague. But the registry noted in the letter that for onward communication to the competent Afghan authorities, as if the embassy not competent, but they can send the order to the Taliban. But they never spelled the name Taliban. The court wasn't satisfied with this, that the transmission of the letter to the Afghan embassy in The Hague. And so the court also asked help from the UN, the United Nations. But the UN also, in line with its established practice, transmitted the order to the permanent representative of Afghanistan to the United Nations in New York, which was also appointed by the former government, not the Taliban. But the court gave up and assumed, because the order was also public too, assumed this was enough. So after asking the help from the UN, the court didn't issue further orders. What happened was eventually the Taliban didn't respond to the order. And so the prosecutor asked from the court the authorization of the resumption of the investigation. And the court authorized the prosecutor to resume the investigation because the prosecutor convinced the court that the Taliban will not be willing or able to investigate these crimes. And so these crimes will go unpunished in Afghanistan. And so now the ICC can exercise its jurisdiction. So the court later on authorized the chief prosecutor to resume the investigation.
Thank you very much, Seyfullah, for these very interesting insights. And I would like to remind everyone who's the present audience here, you may ask your questions in the chat, comments. You can also write in the chat. Please keep them related to the topic of this talk, and we will pick them up during the talk or at the end. Idris, about this ICC investigation, what is your expectation? Could there be convictions at the end? How could the case be continued? It's more a kind of political or even a glass bowl question, but what do you think?
Yeah, so I think for the case to move forward, it will require substantial international cooperation, so including access to evidence and witness testimonies, which can be difficult in a volatile context like Afghanistan. So, I mean, we all know how challenging it is to get witness testimonies in such a complicated cases. So, convictions are impossible, are possible, I think, but the ICC faces logistical and political hurdles. So, particularly when dealing with the non-state actors or governments unwilling to cooperate. So, we have similar cases in different contexts if we look in the history, and also in the challenges that ICC have right now with other cases. If successful, it would set an important precedent for international justice. So, regardless of all the challenges, I think there is a way, but it depends on a lot of different factors, I think.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Idris. Let's move on to the ICJ case, which is the case, to remind everyone of what it's about, under the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Idris, what is the situation here? What is the status of preparations of that case? And how is it related to this ECJ case that you spoke about recently in another forum? Could you tell us with a short introduction, what is the situation, what it's about?
So I will keep myself short. So please feel free during the Q&A maybe to ask, and I will love to maybe give you an overview. So the ICJ case builds on the ECG's landmark ruling, which recognized that women in Afghanistan face systematic gender-based prosecution under the Taliban rule. So this decision not only addressed the individual cases of two asylum seekers, but also set a global precedent by reaffirming the fundamental importance of gender equality. So it's a very interesting argumentation that they're using. And the ICJ case takes this further by focusing specifically on the Taliban's systematic violations of women's rights under the CEDAW. This violation includes the bans on education and employment, effectively erasing women from the public life. And it's the first time CEDAW has been invoked at the ICJ. So that's a really important aspect to mention, and making this case a significant test for the international community's commitment to defending women's rights globally.
Thank you, Idris. Seyfullah, what about the procedures before the ICJ? Could you shed light on that? Could you explain to us in which stage of the procedure this case is at present? And of course, our key question here is, who represents Afghanistan? In this case, the state is the party. So that would be very interesting. Please help us understanding that.
Yes, of course. So at the moment, no application has been filed with the ICJ because Article 29 of the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, or in short, CEDAW, requires parties first resort to negotiation with the party they want to bring to the ICJ. And this is an obligation on states. They have to try negotiations first. And if negotiations fail, the second obligations, they have to try arbitration. So it is again an adjudicative forum, but a little bit more flexible than proper court of law. So they have to try arbitration as a second step. That's also an obligation. So if they can't organize an arbitration with Afghanistan, then they have a right to refer the dispute to the ICJ. And those states who initiated this formal step, who announced that they will take the ICJ take the Taliban to the ICJ, invoked this article, and they said we took formal steps, the first formal steps, and so this means they are in the stage of negotiations with Afghanistan, presumably with the Taliban. So those negotiations are not public, but we assume that they are at the first stage. And if this fails and if an arbitration can't be organized, the matter will go to the ICJ. But even if an arbitration can be organized, the question is the same: who will represent Afghanistan before an arbitral tribunal? Or if it goes to ICJ, who will represent Afghanistan before the ICJ? So as I said, the short answer, or the generally accepted criteria, is effective control. But in international law, the question is much more complicated than this, because state practice varies. So some argue that constitutionality also matters, or democratic legitimacy also matters. But the predominant criterion in international law is the test of effective control. The less controversial criterion is the test of effective control. Whichever entity is in effective control of the state machinery or territory and population, that entity qualifies as the government of the state. And again, as the ICC also pointed out for its own investigations, the non-recognition of the Taliban didn't mean much to me. The ICC gave the example of the International Criminal Court, gave the example of engagement with the Taliban. And the engagement didn't consist only of talking with the Taliban. Some states who publicly refused to recognize the Taliban has also established diplomatic relations, formal diplomatic relations with the Taliban. Or some of them concluded international agreements with the Taliban. Those are, under international law, known to be relations that can be conducted only through governments. And so this also shows that non-recognition of the Taliban by some states wasn't very substantial. Rather, maybe we can argue that remained in political realm. Maybe the purpose was not to politically legitimize the Taliban, rather than deny that it is the government of Afghanistan. So because of the effective control test, and because the non-recognition of the Taliban didn't mean that international community as a whole denied the governmental status of the Taliban, I assume ICJ also can regard the Taliban as the government of Afghanistan for the purposes of the proceedings before it. And this argument got stronger after 26 states who published a statement in support of starting proceedings under CEDAW against the Taliban, said that this is without prejudice to the fact that we don't politically recognize the Taliban as the representatives of the Afghan people, as if intentionally they excluded the point that they may legally recognize the Taliban as the government of Afghanistan, because saying politically, we don't politically recognize as representatives of the Afghan people, rather is a term usually used to not to give political legitimacy rather than legal legitimacy. So they left the argument that Taliban can be regarded as the government of Afghanistan there. So they didn't argue that we don't legally recognize the Taliban as the government of Afghanistan. So we can make another point why the ICJ may regard the Taliban as the government of Afghanistan based on state responsibility. So though not binding, legally binding, international law commission's draft articles on state responsibility or commentary to those draft articles suggest that for the purposes of state responsibility, it is not wise to exonerate a new government from responsibility because it's already because based on concerns on legitimacy. So, and for the purpose of attribution, the draft commentary to the draft articles explicitly says that a general de facto government is already an apparatus of the state for the purpose of attribution. While attribution and representation are two different things, I think because it explicitly accepts the general de facto government as already an apparatus of the state, and because of the other comment I said earlier, I think based on the law of state responsibility, we can say that it is better to let de facto regimes to hold the responsibility of the state's international obligations. And this is also apparent in state practice. The same statement by 26 states that supported the initiative taken against Taliban under CEDAW said that we hold the Taliban, explicitly said that we hold the Taliban for Afghanistan's international obligations, not any other entity. So for the purposes of Afghanistan's international obligations, this means they regard the Taliban as the government of Afghanistan, though they don't want to spell it because I assume not to politically legitimize the Taliban. And so based on these reasons, I assume the ICJ also may regard the Taliban as the government of Afghanistan. And one last reason is the case law of the ICJ, because case law is a supplementary source in international law. Though non-binding um, states give so much importance to previous case law. And previously, ICJ accepted such de facto regimes as the government of the state, or accepted that they can represent their state before the ICJ. For the case in point is Myanmar. So when the Gambia filed an application against Myanmar before the ICJ based on the Genocide Convention, the ICJ didn't delve into issue in detail, but just accepted the fact that the junta that overthrown the democratic elected government can represent Myanmar before the court. Despite the fact that, like the Taliban, the junta's credentials weren't accepted by the United Nations. So Myanmar too, the junta in Myanmar too, wasn't able to represent Myanmar in the United Nations, like the Taliban. So there are similar points, though not exactly, the cases are similar. And so the case law of the ICJ also points us to the argument that the Taliban may be regarded, may be given the legal capacity to represent Afghanistan before the potential proceedings before the ICJ. Yeah, so this is a very difficult question because I have to guess how will states behave in near future. And this, unfortunately, this rather looks like a political question. It should not be. It would be better if states also had been consistent in how to ascertain the lawful government of a state. Unfortunately, states, despite the fact that the generally accepted criterion is effective control, many states, as you said, um, publicly refuse to recognize Taliban, despite being in the effective control, until the Taliban meets some other conditions. Conditions are in addition to the effective control, like respect for human rights, in particular the rights of women, or establishing an inclusive and representative government, or not allowing the territory of Afghanistan to be used against the security of other states, or allowing humanitarian aid to enter Afghanistan, etc. So that's why this is a difficult question in international law. The generally accepted criteria is effective control, but we in state practice we see different criteria set by states like human rights, inclusive government, etc. But that's why I wanted to examine this question in my research article. However, to me, as I said, like Russia, for example, despite explicitly saying that we don't recognize Taliban and we will not recognize the Taliban until it meets this and that condition, they accredited a diplomat at the level of charge d'affaires appointed by the Taliban. So, or more than that, China, despite later denying that this amounted to recognition, accepted an ambassador. The highest level of diplomatic relations is established through ambassadors, and accepted an ambassador appointed by the Taliban government as the ambassador of the state of Afghanistan in China, despite later clarifying that this didn't amount to recognition. So the question is, if establishing formal diplomatic relations, or there are examples of this, entering into international agreements with the Taliban, doesn't imply recognition, then what does imply recognition? Because as I said, under international law, formal diplomatic relations and entering into international agreements are supposed to be done through governments. So to me, non-recognition of some states, the meaning of such non-recognition was limited. More like politically legitimize the Taliban. So it was more like political rather than legal. And so, yes, there may be states very serious about their recognition, that they intend not to legally recognize the Taliban. And yet, many states refuse to establish formal diplomatic relations and enter into international agreements. But what I am saying, this is not how the international community as a whole acts. Simply some state accepted Taliban as the government of Afghanistan by treating it as such. And so for them, it is not to give political legitimacy. So for them, when they feel that Taliban respects women's rights, Taliban protects their security that may come from the Afghan territory, from other non-governmental armed groups, or when Afghanistan allows humanitarian aid into Afghanistan. So when these conditions they set are met, they may issue recognition. But as I said, it will be in political realm, because they already treat the Taliban as the government of Afghanistan. I mean, at least some of the states. So yeah, that is the answer. I don't know what the audience will pick up from them, but that is my answer.
Diplomatic communication, diplomatic interaction is only one task of diplomats. The other task is legal and consular affairs, acting in behalf of the state. And that is, as I mentioned in the beginning of this talk, very important for Afghans everywhere in the world. Idris, we recently talked about that and try to see, okay, which embassies, Afghan embassies in the world, cooperate with the Taliban, are loyal to them, which are not. Are there other cases Maybe you could provide us with a few examples. I remember you had some in your mind immediately.
Yeah, so you mean with the diplomatic interaction with the different embassies? Is that right, how I understand you?
Yeah, how far they are loyal to the Taliban or not?
Yeah.
Different cases.
I mean, you have diplomats who are loyal to the previous government facing immense challenges. Like, let's take the case of Bonn. It's a very interesting one because we have in Germany this combination, which is quite strange comparing to other states. So the Taliban has declared them illegitimate and threatened to revoke their passports and diplomatic status, and acts they perform, such as issuing birth certificate or extending passport, are not recognized in Afghanistan. So this is what they at least said till now. We don't have any case right now. So as far as I can oversee the situation, where we had such an experience of people traveling to Afghanistan and experiencing challenges with their papers, or having any challenges here with the different governmental levels. So creating potential problems for individuals, definitely with these circumstances. I think that will come up. It's just a matter of time. And financially, I think they are in a precarious position. So this kind of embassies, without support from Kabul, these diplomats depend entirely on fees collecting for their services, like in a company. I mean, what you see in Bonn is a kind of a company that offers a specific service, and for that service they charging fees. They're calling it fees, but at the end, it's a price that they can even change. You don't have it even in your hand to rule against it, because it's acting quite similar to a company. So this is only substantial for those based in properties owned by the Afghan state. So as they avoid paying rent or other aspects. For other, the situation is unsustainable and leaves them vulnerable to financial and professional instability. This is something that we need to also consider. And then you're having this case of Munich, which is also really strange. So you're having over there embassy that is recognized by the Taliban, and they recognize the Taliban de facto regime as the legitimate government of Afghanistan, and they're acting in cooperation with the government in Kabul. So we're having a really strange situation in Germany. We don't have right now cases which brings us in a situation where we need to deal with this strange situation. In other countries like UK or Norway, we have a situation where they're just closing embassies. So diplomats are just leaving their positions, and we don't know how to deal with it. So we have a very new situation. So we have aspects which we did not experience in other circumstances in history, which is comparable with that what we're having in Afghanistan.
Yeah, and the case of Germany is particularly interesting. We have two general consulates in Bonn, the former capital of West Germany, and in Munich, and we have the embassy in Berlin. All three main diplomats were appointed before the regime change, and the German government said they would not accept anyone new coming in, appointed by the Taliban. So the persons appointed before the change stay. But Bonn and Berlin continue only legal and consular affairs. So they do these services to the people, but they cannot represent politically anymore. And actually, they do not communicate with Kabul. Only Munich does, for some reasons, some old kind of contacts that existed probably previously. They exist in any case, and they communicate with the foreign ministry in Kabul. However, the consul also says that they only do these consular affairs and nothing else. And even in the garden of that embassy, still there's the old flag of the Islamic Republic, which means there's not really clarity about it. This Taliban wished that all Afghans from all over Europe could use that consulate in Munich, as the place for doing all kind of getting all kind of services, but the German government refused and said, no, please, only for the Germans. That's 400 something thousands. That's many already. But it's a strange situation, a difficult situation in practice. When we look around the world, Washington, D.C., Paris embassies are not communicating with the Taliban, have not declared any loyalty to them. A few others, like in Pakistan, Turkey, China, they are loyal to the new de facto regime. And others, as you said, have not been able to financially continue. And that's, for example, Oslo, Norway, or Brazil and Brasilia. They were closed. So that's the difficult situation here. We could continue from here to the last point. Or let's stay with this for one more moment. I think, Seyfullah, when we prepared this talk, we had also a discussion about the international law background of this question. Could you maybe explain a bit about that?
Yes. So unfortunately, international law doesn't have a solution to this big problem, especially problem for Afghans living abroad. But it is mostly the effects of non-recognition. For example, effects of non-recognition by the UK government or the German government within Germany and within the UK is a matter of their own national legal systems. So the courts in Germany or other public institutions in Germany may or may not recognize the administrative acts of the Taliban, like the birth certificates issued by the Taliban or issued by the embassies controlled by the Taliban. So this depends how the law in Germany is, or how the German government wants it to be, if it is within its own power. So this is mostly a matter of national legal systems themselves. So, but from the past practice, we know that like accepting administrative acts of de facto regimes is not incompatible with non-recognition. So from the past, we know that a state may refuse to recognize a de facto regime like the Taliban, but for humanitarian purposes may accept the administrative acts done by the Taliban or documents issued by the Taliban or Taliban-controlled embassies so that the civilians doesn't bear the burden. So just purely based on humanitarian purposes. So like an Afghan got a marriage certificate within Afghanistan or by an embassy controlled by the Taliban. So it has to prove that he or she is married within Germany. So this is a humanitarian issue, and states we know from the past that doesn't see that their refusal to their willingness to accept such documents from de facto regimes is incompatible with their non-recognition. So non-recognition is another issue, and accepting a document from a de facto regime is another issue. For humanitarian purposes, we know from the past practice states do that. But as I said, it is only a matter of national law, a matter of domestic law, unfortunately. International law doesn't have as far as I understand, a proper solution to this.
So it's up to the states and up to the individuals if they want to go to
So
the
this is because states, to start with, doesn't have to establish consular relations or diplomatic relations with other states. They are not under an obligation to recognize documents issued by them at all. To start with, yeah.
Right, and it's up to the citizens, the Afghan citizens themselves, to decide if they want to go to a certain diplomatic mission, let's say the general consulate in Munich, or not. In interviews, some have said, well, I only want to reside in Germany. I don't care. I can have my passport renewed in any place. I don't mind. But those who want to travel or those who have been publicly critical with the de facto regime and who have relatives in in the country, in Afghanistan, sometimes explain that they have fears that data could be shared, that kind of accepting services from a diplomatic mission that is loyal to the Taliban, or let's say communicates with the foreign ministry in Kabul, could lead to problems. Also, human rights organizations have mentioned that. On the other hand, there's the question of the interest of the host government, which may also have interests. I mean, we remember very well, at least Idris and I and many others also, that Germany has deported people who had been convicted for certain crimes from Germany via another regional country to Afghanistan. And for such acts, however you judge them politically, but for such acts, you need certain communication with the state, even de facto regime where these people should arrive. So having somewhere in their own country a consulate or some other mission which might be willing to issue papers for people who are planned to be deported could also be in the interest of some host government. We also should not oversee or overlook that aspect. So we are in kind of a gray zone of diplomacy, not much legally regulated, and a difficult matter. Another difficult matter on which we wanted to shed light in the last few minutes of this talk is the question of the Afghan state assets. Around 7 billion had been frozen by the, if I remember that correctly, US government after the Taliban came to power. And after that happened, there was a decision of the Biden administration to use half of that amount, 3.5 billion, for humanitarian purposes and give the other half to the victims of the 9/11 attack. Now, that was very surprising to me, because this attack had happened a long time ago, had been committed a long time ago. Idris, you studied that case a bit. Has this been actually realized? Have these victims of 9/11 received those amounts? And what about the other amounts? I would ask maybe Idris first, and then I would be happy if Seyfullah could also comment on that matter.
Yes, I mean, this case is really just a complete mess of already very tragic happening of 2021. So I mean, when I read the decision, I was just not just irritated, I was just completely shocked, because I mean, you don't have such a thing compared to other cases, because this is not really addressing a specific government who is now in power and in the palace in Kabul, but it addressing the Afghans. So it was really irritating. So anyhow, so yes, the US allocated half of the 7 billion in frozen assets for humanitarian assistance in Afghanistan. However, the other half remains tied on ongoing litigations by 9/11 victims' families. This division has been criticized. I mean, you're finding here and there some really good articles in that, but also by journalists for failing to address Afghanistan's economic crisis effectively, as humanitarian aid alone is insufficient to stabilize the country right now. And we see that even after 3 years in Afghanistan. Yeah, so I mean, this is what you can say about the situation right now, and there are a lot of other aspects maybe we can discuss during the Q&A.
What do you know about the case, Seyfullah?
So, in terms of the case, I can't add much to what Idris said. So, under international law, normally the assets of central banks are immune from jurisdiction or execution. So, but the matter discussed was the previous judgments was against Taliban due to 9/11 event. But now the Taliban is it the government of Afghanistan or not? And this also raises that question. So if so, the victims of 9/11 or their families argue that previous judgments were against the Taliban, and now the Taliban is in control in Afghanistan, and so we can execute those judgments against the Afghan assets because we can assume that they belong to the Taliban. But this is a matter also in isolation from who is in control or not, because it is still the assets of the state of Afghanistan and in principle are immune from jurisdiction. The other matter is, as it is said, half of it was allocated to a fund for humanitarian purposes, so that can be spent on Afghan people. But when this allocation was made, this was made against the wishes of the Taliban. Taliban just simply wants to access the assets. So the question is, if the Taliban is the rightful government of Afghanistan, can it be denied access to Afghan assets? Because it is the sovereign right of Afghanistan to access their assets whenever they want. And if it is the Taliban who is legally speaking on behalf of Afghanistan, then denying the Taliban to access those assets based on the fact of its non-recognition, in principle, looks like violating the sovereignty of Afghanistan. And as far as I know, the US denied access to the Taliban based on its non-recognition. It rather assigned to other people rather than the Afghan government's representatives to dispose this $3.5 billion that was allocated for humanitarian purposes. So to me, doing this based on non-recognition of the Taliban is wrong. So what, to the extent that Taliban is the lawful government of Afghanistan. But this can be done in other grounds, like denying the Taliban to access assets can be done under other grounds, other potential grounds in international law. International law, for example, allows countermeasures. So when a state violates an obligation against another state, that state has a right to resort to countermeasures, like they can suspend an obligation toward that state in return of its violation, prior violation. And yeah, Taliban didn't violate any obligations against the US, but the violations of the Taliban amounts to erga omnes violations, like the alleged violations of human rights, the rights of women, amount to erga omnes violations, meaning those are obligations owed, the violations like the human rights obligations, the women's rights obligations, or obligations owed to the international community as a whole. And so every state can take action when these types of obligations are violated. So the US or other countries may freeze the assets based on this ground because it is a violation of an erga omnes obligation. And so in response, as a countermeasure, they deny access to the central bank assets. This is a potential ground, but to me, based on doing this based on non-recognition looks wrong. Yeah, simply.
Thank you very much, Seyfullah. So it will be also important to further observe these developments. I read that this fund for the Afghan people in Switzerland has not been used at all since 2022, I'm sorry. We are 2 years later now. And it would be interesting to find out if any, let's say, humanitarian organizations or others can apply for some parts of the fund's portions for that, to use it for humanitarian purposes in the country. But that's very, very unclear. The board consists of Afghan nationals and representatives of the US government, so there's still control over that also exercised by the US government. And as to this other case, the 3.5 million that were designated for the 9/11 victims, these seem to be still in the US. Also money from the Afghanistan Bank, the central bank of Afghanistan. And also there's no more information that we could gather about what happens now with them, as they have not been distributed, I would say, happily to anyone else. Yes, victims should be compensated, but not with the money that is owned by the Afghan people. With this interesting question, and unfortunately without having an easy answer on that, with just an insight about, okay, what is the situation? What do we know about it? We are almost at the end of this talk. I've seen that there have been a few questions that have been written into the chat, and we will talk about them briefly in a few minutes. But before that, I would like to very much thank those taking part in this talk. Idris and Seyfullah Akbari, I want to mention her name again, together with me prepared this talk, and Seyfullah Hasar, you've been a fantastic guest. You are still a fantastic guest. It was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you. I'm very happy to have joined this conversation.
Thank you.